The story of Canada's oil sands, from discovery to modern development. Canada's oil sands, often referred to as tar sands, represent one of the world's largest proven reserves of petroleum. Located primarily in the province of Alberta, these deposits are a critical component of Canada's economy and energy sector. The journey from the initial discovery of these vast reserves to the sophisticated extraction processes used today is a story of innovation, controversy, and resilience. This article traces the history of Canada's oil sands from their humble beginnings to their status as a global energy powerhouse, early discoveries, and Indigenous knowledge. Long before European settlers arrived in North America, Indigenous peoples in the region now known as Alberta were aware of the oil sands. They used the naturally occurring bitumen to waterproof their canoes, and for other practical purposes. The Cree and other First Nations communities had a deep understanding of the land and its resources, recognizing the value of the sticky substance for centuries. The first recorded European encounter with the oil sands occurred in 1717, when a Cree guide showed the area to Hudson's Bay Company fur trader, Henry Kelsey. Later, in 1788, Alexander Mackenzie, another explorer, mentioned the presence of bituminous sands in his journal during his quest to find a route to the Pacific Ocean. These early accounts hinted at the vast potential of the oil sands, but the technology and understanding necessary to exploit these resources were still centuries away. Early 20th century, the first attempts at commercialization, the true potential of the oil sands began to attract serious attention in the early 20th century. In 1908, Charles Mair, an advocate for Canadian resource development, wrote about the oil sands, predicting that they would one day become a significant source of wealth. The first substantial effort to extract oil from the sands came in the 1920s, when Carl Clark, a scientist at the University of Alberta, developed a method for separating bitumen from sand using hot water. This process, known as the Clark hot water extraction process, became the foundation for modern oil sands extraction. Carl Clark's method was revolutionary at the time, providing a practical way to separate bitumen from the sand. But the process was still far from being commercially viable. In the 1920s and 1930 seconds, there were attempts to develop the oil sands, but these efforts were hampered by technical challenges, lack of infrastructure, and the fact that conventional oil was cheaper and easier to produce. One of the early pioneers of oil sands development was Max Ball, an American entrepreneur who founded Abasin Oils Ltd. in 1930. His company attempted to establish a commercial oil sands operation near Fort McMurray, Alberta. Despite significant investment and the construction of a small plant, the venture was plagued by technical difficulties and financial troubles, and it eventually shut down during World War II. Post-war era, renewed interest and government involvement. The post-war period saw renewed interest in the oil sands, driven by a growing recognition of the need for secure energy supplies. In 1944, the Canadian government established the Alberta Research Council to explore ways to develop the oil sands. This move signaled a shift in approach, as the government began to take a more active role in fostering oil sands development. In 1962, the Great Canadian Oil Sands GCOS project, backed by Sun Oil Company later Suncor Energy, marked a significant milestone. The project was the first large-scale commercial operation in the oil sands, utilizing an improved version of the Clark hot water extraction process. The GCOS plant, located near Fort McMurray, began production in 1967, producing around 45,000 barrels of oil per day. This achievement marked the beginning of the modern oil sands industry. However, the early years were challenging. The cost of production was high, and the volatile oil prices of the 1970s created uncertainty in the industry. Despite these challenges, the oil sands continued to attract investment, as companies and governments recognized the long-term potential of these vast reserves. The 1970s and 1980 seconds, expansion and innovation. The 1970s and 1980 seconds were a period of significant expansion and innovation in the oil sands. The oil price shocks of the 1970s, caused by geopolitical tensions in the Middle East, highlighted the need for stable and secure sources of oil. This led to increased interest in the oil sands, both from Canadian and international companies. One of the most important developments during this period was the introduction of new extraction techniques, such as in situ methods. Unlike traditional surface mining, in situ extraction involves drilling wells into the oil sands and injecting steam to heat the bitumen, making it flow more easily to the surface. The most common in situ technique is steam-assisted gravity drainage (SAGD), which was developed in the 1980s and has become a key method for extracting oil from deeper deposits that cannot be mined. In 1978, Syncrude Canada Ltd., a consortium of oil companies, began operations at its oil sands mine near Fort McMurray. Syncrude quickly became one of the largest producers of synthetic crude oil from the oil sands, and its success demonstrated the viability of large-scale oil sands development. Throughout the 1980s, the oil sands industry continued to grow, but it also faced challenges. Environmental concerns began to emerge as a significant issue, with critics pointing to the impact of oil sands development on the landscape, water resources, and air quality. The industry also faced economic challenges, as the high cost of production made it vulnerable to fluctuations in global oil prices. The 1990s and 2010s, the oil sands boom. The 1990s and 2010s saw a dramatic transformation of the oil sands industry, driven by technological advancements, rising oil prices, and increased global demand for energy. During this period, the oil sands became a central pillar of Canada's economy, attracting billions of dollars in investment and creating thousands of jobs. In 1997, the Alberta government introduced the oil sands royalty regime, which provided favorable tax and royalty terms for oil sands developers. This policy change, combined with advancements in extraction technology, helped to spur a new wave of investment in the oil sands. By the early 2000s, oil sands production was growing rapidly, and Canada was emerging as a major player in the global oil market. Companies like Suncor, Syncrude, and Shell invested heavily in expanding their operations, while new players entered the market. The construction of new pipelines, such as the Alberta Clipper and Keystone pipelines, helped to connect the oil sands to markets in the United States and beyond. During this period, the oil sands became a significant driver of economic growth in Alberta and Canada as a whole. The industry created thousands of high-paying jobs, both directly and indirectly, and contributed billions of dollars in tax revenue to governments. Fort McMurray, the hub of oil sands activity, experienced rapid population growth and economic development, transforming from a small town into a bustling city. Environmental and social concerns. Despite the economic benefits, the rapid expansion of the oil sands industry also brought significant environmental and social challenges. The scale of development led to concerns about the impact on the boreal forest, wildlife habitats, and indigenous communities. The extraction process requires large amounts of water and energy, and it generates significant greenhouse gas emissions, making the oil sands one of the most carbon-intensive forms of oil production. The environmental impact of the oil sands became a major point of contention, both within Canada and internationally. Environmental groups raised concerns about the destruction of ecosystems, the pollution of water bodies, and the contribution to climate change. Indigenous communities, many of whom live near oil sands operations, expressed concerns about the impact on their traditional lands, health, and way of life. In response to these concerns, the oil sands industry and the Canadian government took steps to mitigate the environmental impact. Companies invested in research and development to improve the efficiency of extraction processes, reduce water usage, and lower greenhouse gas emissions. The government introduced regulations to address environmental concerns, including requirements for land reclamation and monitoring of water quality. Despite these efforts, the oil sands remained a controversial issue, particularly in the context of global efforts to combat climate change. Critics argued that the development of the oil sands was incompatible with Canada's climate goals, while supporters emphasized the economic importance of the industry and the need for energy security. The 2010s and beyond, challenges and opportunities. The 2010s were a period of both opportunity and challenge for the oil sands industry. On the one hand, technological advancements and high oil prices continued to drive production growth. On the other hand, the industry faced increasing scrutiny from environmentalists, governments, and investors. One of the most significant challenges was the volatility of global oil prices. The oil price crash of 2014, driven by a supply glut and weakening demand, had a major impact on the oil sands. Many projects were delayed or canceled, and companies were forced to cut costs and lay off workers. The economic downturn in Alberta, which was heavily dependent on the oil sands, highlighted the risks of relying on a single industry. At the same time, the oil sands faced growing pressure from environmentalists and climate activists, who argued that the industry was incompatible with efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The expansion of pipelines, such as the Keystone XL and Trans Mountain pipelines, became flashpoints for protests and legal battles. In response to these challenges, the oil sands industry and the Canadian government took steps to adapt. Companies invested in technologies to reduce emissions, such as carbon capture and storage (CCS) and more efficient extraction methods. The government introduced policies to promote clean energy and reduce carbon emissions, while also supporting the continued development of the oil sands. Despite these efforts, the future of the oil sands remains uncertain. The transition to a low-carbon economy, driven by global climate goals, poses a significant challenge for the industry. At the same time, the demand for oil is expected to remain strong in the coming decades, particularly in developing countries. The legacy and future of the oil sands. The story of Canada's oil sands is one of resilience, innovation, and controversy. From the early days of Indigenous knowledge and exploration to the modern era of large-scale production, the oil sands have played a central role in Canada's economic development. The industry has created wealth, jobs, and energy security, but it has also faced significant environmental and social challenges. As the world grapples with the challenge of climate change, the future of the oil sands is uncertain. The industry must navigate a complex landscape of evolving technologies, changing regulations, and shifting public attitudes. Whether the oil sands continue to be a cornerstone of Canada's economy or become a relic of the past will depend on the choices made by governments, companies, and society as a whole. In the end, the story of the oil sands is a testament to the power of human ingenuity and the complexities of balancing economic development with environmental stewardship. As Canada looks to the future, the legacy of the oil sands will continue to shape the nation's identity and its place in the global energy landscape.